Yeah, so we're going to talk about RESTful APIs, specifically with Flask. I believe this is a project that was released today, which is a good thing because I've seen a lot of learners decide to build an API as the end of Foundations project. Okay, some really nice APIs. So today we're going to understand what APIs are and in the process come up with a very simple one to demonstrate whatever we're going to cover. So to start, just a simple question. What do you understand by the word API based on your reading so far? What does an API mean? Just the words, like what does A stand for, PI? Or UI, what's UI?
Somebody hear me or what? What's going on? Hello? Am I audible?
Yeah, yeah, you're audible now.
Oh
If
yeah,
you are initially, we couldn't hear.
yeah. I'm sorry. Well, it's application. Oh god, I forgot application interface. I forgot the first one. It's like I don't care about the application. I wanna get some the business logic. I don't care about it. I need some information. So it's like interface literally. You don't really know about anything about the back end. You know this part of a program, this code provides some data. So they're giving you an interface to get to fetch some data from it, and they give you in a standard what do we call it in a standard I'm really confused. I'm sorry, I'm so sick. um in a standard form, kind of. So this is my understanding. I hope you can correct it.
All right, awesome. Yeah,
Correct.
that's correct. That's correct.
Great.
So,
Can I
Francis, please,
add something?
someone else wants to give it a go.
Yeah, so from my understanding, I see API, application program interface, as an interface or an intermediary which helps the client to get certain information from the servers. So let's say if I want to get maybe I'm coming up with a program and then I need to have a weather forecast on my program, I can get that information from Google, which has a well trusted weather forecast information. But then to get that information, I need an API which will help me get that specific information. So the API sort of helps us get what we want from the server, something like that. Yeah.
Awesome. So all those are correct descriptions for an API. A good thing is you already have had a very nice introduction with APIs, but mostly initially you are consuming APIs that were built by someone else. So at this stage of the program, it's actually like you building your own API that your applications can consume or someone else's application can consume. So based on the API that you're going to build, you can just like expose the endpoints and then anyone else can be able to use that API. That's if you make it public. This is just a simple client server model. Sorry, I need to expand that. Yeah, so this is just a simple client server model. And as you can see, we have various interfaces. For instance, right here is a user. Right here is a user who is like viewing, let's say, your website. And what they are seeing is actually a user interface, and they can interact with that. Should look pretty, right? Your users should, your user interface should be like easy to use, probably appealing to your users, etc., etc., because these are human beings trying to interact with your system. And then we have a front-end part of the application built in JavaScript. Let's say JavaScript, HTML, CSS. Probably that's what is going to increase the interactivity that the user expects from our application. So we can say, basically, this is what we're trying to send to our users, right? So that's going to our users. But remember, this is just the front end. There is no actual data inside right here, right? We need to get some data so that we can give it to our users. For instance, this is an app that, let's say this is Airbnb clone. You need your users to be able to view, let's say, the houses that are available for bookings, right? And to be able to do that, you need to get some data. And that's why we have some database right here. But one of the worst decision you can make is to directly enable your interface right here to interact with your database directly. That can bring a very huge security risk, because if I come to this page and then let's say view page source, you can see I can see the code for that, including some JavaScript and HTML. So that's code that can be manipulated probably by, let's say, hackers or just anyone with a substantial amount of knowledge, and they're able to maliciously interact with your data, probably adding something that you don't need or deleting your data altogether. So you don't want these ones to interact directly, right? You don't want that. And that's why you have some backend built, in this case, using Python. This is more like the logic, how do you get data from the database? How do you add data to the database? Probably your users are giving you that. How do you update, etc. We're going to talk about those later. But right now, for this application to interact with our backend, which is built in Python in this case, we need a way for them to communicate, right? And that's where APIs come in, that interface for two different applications to communicate with each other. You can see these are completely different. Like one is running on JavaScript, another is running on Python. So what you do here is you design a REST API. REST are just like constraints that make this to be uniform across, let's say, everyone building RESTful APIs. So what you can do is you can build an API to expose the endpoints right here. For instance, let's say you need to expose states where your rooms are for booking. So you could do an endpoint like, let's say, let me add some text. I need text. Oh, let me try that. Or let's do this, and then pull that up. So you can expose something like your stats, /stats. So, and this one probably is something like that, which is basically for your application right here to be able to fetch those stats. How do you display those you have to use a uniform interface for that. For instance, JSON representation for this data to be fetched by your front end. Probably you could do a post to be able to add and the other methods that you know. Just to ensure everyone is muted. So you can just unmute when you want to ask or add something into whatever we're talking about. All right, so that's basically on an overview of what APIs are. And if we combine every person's definition that we were given, we find that it's alternating around two software applications being able to communicate with each other, right? To communicate or interact with each other. All right, so what's REST? Just like we mentioned, REST is a set of constraints, I would say, or guidelines when you are designing your API. Okay, and we have 6 key principles that if you follow, your APIs are going to be considered RESTful. Okay, I think this one is a bit optional, but if you follow the other 5 of them, then your APIs are going, your API is basically going to be considered RESTful. And that's what we're going to see when we create our simple API. So we have first client server. Let's say for instance, in this case, you can see the client side of the application is able to communicate with the server side. Okay. We have uniform interface. Remember, the interface is at this point. And what we mean here is having one way or providing just a uniform way through which your resources are going to be displayed. And the standard is mostly like following the standard HTTP methods. Let's say, how are your resources being identified? For instance, in this case, it's a good practice to represent your endpoints in a way that every consumer of that can with just one look, they can notice what your APIs are or what that endpoint does. For instance, when you check this, you can know that this one tries to get a state. Let's say to add a state, something like, or to get a specific state, something like state slash ID will give you one state. Or if you are developing a learning management system, then something like, let me see if I have a project. So something like project slash ID is going to give you a specific project, right? This is self-explanatory just by looking at the endpoint itself. Another thing is what's the representation that you are using. So we could use, in our case, we're going to use JSON or JavaScript object notation. You could use other ways like XML. You have statelessness, which basically means that each request to the API is stateless in a way that the server doesn't save your request, or basically your API does not save your request. Each time you make a request, it should have enough information for you to be served with a response. For example, you have an API that requires your users to log in. Each time your user sends a request, it should have either the token or maybe password, depending on how you are authenticating them. Each time they make a request, it should include that information that allows your API to authenticate them, because it's not saved. That will mean each request is an independent and a different request. We have layered system. At some point, you will need to like have a load balancer, your APIs, have a database layer, application layer, probably later or maybe during this project still. Caching, you can cache maybe in the server side or client side, depending on your architecture, okay? Code on demand, just like we said, this one is an optional principle, but basically what it does is sometimes you might need to send code snippets to your users. How APIs work, we can check right here. It mostly just works like the client server model that you learned about earlier. So the principles are here, you can read about them still. Setless, layered system, code on demand, and all those that he talks about. So how they work, first, client sends a request. If your APIs requires authentications, that's done. So users are authenticated. Server receives the request and processes it internally. Let's say based on if you need to get some results from your database, or probably you need to add or update just anything, the server is able to process that. And then finally, the server returns a response to whoever that request came from. That's more like the client server model flow, basically how the web works, right? RESTful routes. We use the HTTP verbs to be able like to tell the server what to do. I think the default one is usually get, which is basically like retrieving data from your database, then processing it based on your backend logic, displaying that as in the endpoint, and then someone can consume your endpoint. So that's what get does, fetching data from your API. Post will add new data. We have put, which is basically to modify existing data that you had already added to your database. Then delete is removing the data. So you might need to look at this word. Basically what it means is, for instance, if you do post twice, it's going to add duplicate data into your database unless you have defined it in a way that it doesn't accept like records that aren't unique. Okay, but if you do a put, which is updating your records, then no matter how many times you do a put to the same record, as long as it was already saved initially, it won't affect your records in the database or maybe file storage, whatever you're storing your data in. In our case, we're just going to use a simple Python list to do that, or dictionary, or just any data structure in Python. Also delete, anytime you delete an item and then it's removed from your storage, once you delete again, it shouldn't like go ahead to delete a different record that you didn't mean to, okay? So once you delete or once you update, it's done, and even if you try repeating the same thing, it won't have a side effect. But something like post would, get request will return the same data as long as you are doing you are querying the same endpoint. For instance, /stats will always return the sets that you have in your database. Okay. So those are the various routes that you can have, and they correspond to the CRUD operations. It's basically the most common thing that you do in your applications, right? You have users querying your database, displaying that data, interacting with it. At some point, they need to add some data or maybe update. Let's say you are registering them to your system. So they need like to add the information into your database. And when you are trying to log them in, you need to fetch that information from database, confirm if it's the same as the one that they are providing, then based on that, authenticate or deny them entry. Okay. So that's the common routes that we have: get, post, put, delete, or the HTTP verb. So building a RESTful API with Flask. This is basically what you are required to do. Let's see with that. See a simple API. Yeah, someone has a hand up. Please ask your question.
Hello, my name is James.
Yeah.
And I wanted to ask, what's the difference between APIs and web scraping? Because I'm kind of confused.
Web scrap, who wants to answer that? Probably you can differentiate based on the project that you did. Anyone?
Can I help?
Sure.
Hello?
Yeah, go ahead.
So web scraping or it's in a way that you get information from the website, a particular website. So let's say if you want, it's a way of browsing. Let's say browsing the website with a terminal or something like that, or browsing the website with an application. And so the web scraping actually uses APIs to do that. So it is the API that you use to pick the information you want. And the process of you picking the information and manipulating the information as whatever you want, that is the web scraping. So you use APIs to web scrap. That is what I understand about it.
So that's a good response. Someone else to add something?
Hi, good day.
Good day.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The difference between, in my own understanding, and from what I understood in what we did, is you web scraping is that like getting data from a website, and API is an avenue for you to get that data. You use API to scrape the website to get the data from that website, and this is mostly common to people who are doing who are into data analysis and AI, ML, and all these things. So you get the data from there, you manipulate it. That is you do crude operation in the data that you got from the website. For instance, now the project we did yesterday, that is I think web scraping with that is JavaScript. So we did that. We manipulated some data, that of Star Wars and the actors and a lot of people. So the difference is just that you are getting a data from a website in order to manipulate, maybe create, or maybe update it, or get an information from that data. Then API is an avenue by which you use to get the data that you get from the website. That is my understanding. Thank you.
Nice. That's a good one. So web scraping, you're getting data from websites that could be like raw HTML from a certain site that you are trying to target. An API, you are getting data from someone who built that specifically for you to be able like to fetch data from that. So they quite interrelate, and mostly you'll need knowledge of APIs to be able like to do web scraping. And scraping is going to be, let's say, much more flexible because you more like have the control of the amount of data that you need to get. But for instance, with the API that you are interacting with previously, let's say the Reddit API, you do not have much control, or already most of the things are already provided for you, the data that you can get. And yeah, so probably that. But I believe we've already had good differentiation between the two. So yeah. So we need to build a simple API which will enable us like to at least use the most common methods that we discussed about, which is get, post, put, and delete. To get started, so first you need to know that in your case you had a database. I think you created an ORM using using SQL Alchemy, and you can use that to interact with your database, which is quite straightforward because you do not write SQL statements. Instead, you're basically like writing more of Python code to be able to interact with your database. Your previous records might have been destroyed. For instance, initially you might need to add the data again. I know you already had that, but probably you lost it. So you might need to create the data into your database just for testing purposes. So add a few records and you'll be good to go. So first thing first is to get to set up a Flask environment, which you can quickly find from this installation guide right here, depending on how you need to work with Flask. I encourage you to use a virtual environment because it's going to give you much more flexibility on the environments that you are going to set. Okay. So this is actually the documentation. So that's why I'm just going to copy the commands around to get Flask in my virtual environment. So after that, I just need to install Flask right there. Oh, good. So first things first, create our file that we're going to work with. So let's call it application.py. Let's then see the simplest application that we can have in Flask. By checking that, I think this one. This one is the hello world for Flask that you can use to just test that our environment is good to go. me close this. So then I'm going to paste that from Flask, import that. Our app name is going to be that. So app route hello world, and then just return that, right? Then let's try to run Python 3 application.py. It doesn't run probably because we are in the main terminal. So we need to say something like we need to run it in the main terminal. So we might need if num call to main run app.run, right? So we do it. Should be good. So we need to set the debug mode to true also. We aren't running
Sorry
like
to
this.
interrupt you.
Yes?
Don't ask the question. Sorry to interrupt you, sir.
Yeah, please go
I
ahead.
want to ask the underscore name. I'm trying to understand why is actually starting, like why we use it instead of. I want to know if we can actually use something else instead of underscore name, and then the meaning of it. Why are we using it? Why are we attaching it to the flags method? So did you get my question?
So you're asking the importance of this and why we are using it.
No, not that. The app equals to flags, then open parentheses underscore name at the third line. The third line.
Okay, yeah, this one right here.
Yes, the importance of the underscore name. Can we use something else instead of underscore name? Like can we use something else? And what's the importance of using it?
Nice. So basically we're trying to create an instance of this so that we can initiate our app, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So you need an instance of the Flask in order to be able to run our application. So that's
like I
why.
wanted to yeah, the like I'm asking if we could use something else instead of is it compulsory that it has to be underscore name underscore that particular, like call it a variable or so? Is it compulsory that it has to be? Can we use something else?
I would recommend like going with the default, just like we can see in the documentation. We might need that so that like when we look, we're trying to look for resources like templates and static files. So Flask automatically knows like where to look at. So when you create a static folder, then it knows those are static files. When you create templates, so if you decide to go with a different name, I believe you'll have to do a lot of configurations yourself. Remember, Flask is a micro framework that you can change a lot of things and how they work. So you can remove the default, use yours, but I wouldn't recommend that
Okay, thank you.
if you are trying to go with the default.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. All right, so you can also check what web server gateway interface means, because that's why we are creating the Flask class and then creating an instance of that. And the argument that we gave, which is this, is the applications module or packet, which is the argument that it takes. So yeah, we're going to go with the defaults, of course, in this case. So that's why we are using that. Then we have up run. Remember, we're running it different from how they are doing it, right? Here we could do the sum, but I believe this is also a good way of running your Flask app, right? So yeah, so we have various options that we can add here. One is debug mode. You can put it to true. It's a good practice mostly when you're in the developing phase of your application, so that it can show you where certain errors occurred. But when you are going to production, you might need to set it to something like false or remove it. I think the default is it being off. Another thing is, but before we add that, let me show you. Let's try and run it first. So our app is live. If I open this link, I get hello world, which is what I expected. Also, we can use curl to test it out. We can also use curl, so I'm going to copy that. Let me zoom this in a little bit. So copy that and then have it right there and just use curl. And we get still hello world. Why did you use curl? Because it's a good utility for testing your APIs. As you are going to see, for things like get, we're just going to run them directly in our browser. But something like post, we might need this utility to be able to do that. Something else we could use is Postman. So check it out. It's also a good tool for testing this. Good thing with it, it's not a terminal like this one. So it gives you some nice interface with where you can add data that you want to add, or you can maybe put the method that you want to use and such things. So you can just like install it. It's supported in all the popular distros. For instance, right now I expect you to be using Ubuntu. So you can install it for Ubuntu, but not in your sandbox. Okay. So in your sandbox, just use car, or in your servers, just use car. To test, you just need to, you can install it on your own machine so that you test your endpoints from there. Okay. So next, I'm going to like create our database. Like we said, we're not going to create an actual database because of time and all. And because this session is just like focused on RESTful APIs, and that's what we want to demonstrate. And one of the quickest ways to do that is just by creating a simple list of dictionaries with our data. For instance, in your case, what I would expect is you should have a database for this. And remember, the database, you're not creating it right now. Right now, you're just adding some data to work with in your database. You should have created it earlier already when you're working on ORMs. So going to create our database in quotes. It is going to be a list of dictionaries. So let's say we're going to have an ID. ID is just going to be a random thing. Let me copy it from here. So for instance, we have stats. So let's say we have this stat with that ID So going to add it into our data, and then we have name, right? Name is going to be that. Sorry. Let's add a second one. And another one is going to be ID, and then some random ID, which is going to be for what? California. Copy that ID. Remember, in actual APIs, when you're building for maybe your future projects, you don't want the ID to be something like this. This is not a good way to like generate your IDs, I think, for your APIs at least. So you might need to have the database generate them automatically for you. And it's going to be like an ID of 0, 1, 2, 3. You can see, for instance, /projects /ID of 301 will give me the RESTful API project. So you can see these IDs are quite simple to use when you're using this API. But these hours are quite difficult too. So that one is going to be California. And then something I'm going to do is that I'll need to test things out right here. So Python, and then paste it right there. What's the type of this? Is it a list or dictionary? So yeah, so it's a list of dictionaries. That's what we're going to work with. So right now, when I saved this, yeah, it seems to be like restarting whenever I save, right? That's what we needed. If yours doesn't, mostly because maybe you set environment variables or you are using this method of Flask run, just find out how you can reload Flask. Sounds automatically reload Flask up. Auto reloading on code. So you can see you can run it that way. Or configure it that way. Not really what we are looking for, but so you can add such things as this. So extra files /that. So you can add it right here. Let's see if it doesn't reload, but I believe it will most of the times. And then just add application.py. Which is basically the name of our application, right? So now it's going to be reloading automatic, but since it's already happening, we do not need that line. We just need to ensure debug is true. So right here is our data. Let's say we're getting that from our database. So in your typical ORM, you could do something like stat dot objects.get or whatever SQL alchemy does it. I'm not sure. Objects.get.all, something like that. And then what you're going to get is your stats from the database. So that's the similar thing that we're trying to get right here. So let's first implement a simple GET request that basically is going to be returning the data from our database, okay? For instance, in your case, you are supposed to retrieve a list of all state objects. That's what we're trying to achieve here. Getting a list of all state objects. And what are our states? Our states are these ones. So we need to get that. And to do that, we're going to implement a simple route that gets all the states that we have. So let's do that. So again, it's going to be app.route/states, right? We do not have the API folder, the v1. What we have is just the states. And what we need to implement is just a simple function that is going to help us do that. So get stats, and what that does is just basically returning the stats that we have. Stats, right? Turn those ones. We loaded, then query that. We get the stats that we have, but we have a problem. Why? Because we are returning a Python list. And one of the things that we said about RESTful APIs, they should align with the uniform interface principle. So we need to ensure that we are using that. And for that, we're going to use JSON. You could use XML, but not a Python list. You might face difficulties like trying to consume this API because we are returning data in form of a list, which is a Python object or a Python data structure. So we don't want that. We need to return something that's uniform across various languages, across various systems that we will be trying to use to be able to work with our API. So that's why you need to ensure you do that using something like JavaScript object notation or XML. I haven't worked with XML, so we're just going to go with JSON. And with Flask, one of the ways to change your data to JSON is using something that we call JSONify. So let's see that. I'm gonna change to JSON. So this is the function that we're going to use, which basically is going to change our data from a Python data structure to JSON, right? You can see it works similar like whatever you used initially, the JSON.dumps function in Python, okay? So let's quickly do that. So JSONify args keyword arguments. We're just going to have one argument, which is stats. So you can see, for instance, right here, we have a list of users. And we need to return the JSON format of that. This is what we do, JSONify users. It's a good practice to define your status codes as usual. That was stated in one of your resources. For type, for us, we're going to specify that when you are getting the data itself, okay? So basically something we will want is this one. Return the JSON format of our users. So going to return that, sorry. So we do not have users, but we have states, right? And that should be mapped to whatever we have here, which is states. We have an issue here, so we need to import that. JSONify. Let's see if our server is running. Yeah, so it's okay. So we just need to reload that and we get the data in JSON format, okay? So what's making this a RESTful API so far? Number one is how we're getting our resources, okay? For instance, /states to get the states that we have in our database, right? Or in our list, or in our file storage, whatever you are using as your storage. So that uniform interface is enabling us to, okay, we're using /states to get the states, which is basically the resource naming. The route is corresponding to the actual resources that we have, in this case, states. Then we also have uniform interface where we're trying to render our data in form of JSON in this case, okay? So we are able to do that. We can also use curl, remember? We can also use curl to be able to query that. So curl. Our route is that. But it's going to be /states. And you see that you get the states that we have in our database, right? That's one of the routes that you are supposed to do. You can also specify the method. For instance, we could do curl. We could do it using that, specifying the method, but I think it's going to be the default. Remember, these methods is just you defining them. Okay, you can post into your database using a GET request. Just depends on how you are designing them. So you see, you get the same result. Okay. So that's the GET, which is basically like to retrieve a list of states. And the only difference in your case is that you are getting that from a database. Okay. Other than a Python list, but get request, that's how you do it. That's how you develop an endpoint for that. Another thing is, let's say we need to get a specific state. This is similar to like saying we need to get a list of projects, right? So we get some projects, we get all the projects that we have right there. This is the similar thing that we are doing. Remember, this is an endpoint that we have an API for. So we just like getting that data from there and displaying it nicely to the user using the user interface. Okay. How about, this is similar to what we did with stats, where we got all the stats that we have in our database. How about if we need a specific stat? In this case, let's say we need a specific project, say project with that ID. We get our project named deploy static, okay, with that ID. So let's try doing the same using our API that we're currently developing. So to do that, first, let's see from here, we have this Python list. Let's say we needed to get a state with an ID, this one. So with this ID, how we do that in just simple Python, is basically checking whether the user gave us that ID and then returning it, okay? So something like all the states. So for states in, let's say, states. So we get one state. Let's print it first. Print states. So we get the states that are there. You can see these are dictionaries. So first dictionary with the first state, which includes ID and name, and a second one. Okay, dictionary items, I mean. So how we can get each element from an element given an ID is, for instance, with our, for right there, instead of printing, we need to check if the state that the user gave, in this case, it's going to be this state right here. So if that state, but we don't need the state itself. Remember, when you are getting the state, you get this dictionary with ID and name key. So what we want is given a certain ID, right? So you can get a state ID by that. So if state ID equal to something that a user gave us, let's say the user gave us this ID, okay? We want to put it in quotes because it's a long string. We need that, and then that's when we need to print that state, okay? You can see we get that specific state that the user passed. It's going to be a similar thing that we're going to implement. So to do that, first things first, we have the endpoint given to us. For instance, we need to get a specific ID given the ID. So ours is going to be /state/ID because we don't have the other folders as given there. So app.route given that ID, put it inside right there, and then define. In this case, it's just get state, one state. Something that the user is going to give us is going to be this state ID. And then now we're going to follow the same thing that we did right here. For instance, for state in states, it's the same thing. In your case, remember states will be in your database. So you're getting that from not like me who is just getting it from this list right above here. So for state in states, what do we want? We want the state that the user gave. So if state ID equal to a given ID, right? So in this case, it's going to be if state ID equal to a given ID, which is basically this ID right here, the ID that the user passed in the request, okay? Then we do not want to print, we just need to return the JSON format of that state, just like we did here. So JSON format of that. So state is going to be what? The state which we got. Hope this is making sense. What if the state is not found? We need to give a user a very good error message. For instance, this project exists, so we give the user a project. What if the user asked for a project that doesn't exist? Does -1? So the page you are looking for doesn't exist. You might have mistyped. So these are things that we need to display to our users in case our resources haven't been found. Okay, so let's implement that. In our case, if the state is not found, then we need to return a JSON format of that. Why are we returning a JSON format? So that because it's a uniform way of representing data in APIs. Remember, even this page tried fetching from the API, got a JSON response saying something like return JSONify error. Let's say it doesn't exist. Doesn't exist, something like that. And then you can take this and map it to your users. This one is going to be that. So you take this and exist. You take this and map it to your users, okay? How? By developing a nice UI like this one, but basically based on if message or this. So let's try that. Let's give it a try. So restarted, reload that, and then let's say we need to get one state, ID of one. You can see we get the error message that we defined, it doesn't exist. How about if we get a state that actually exists? For instance, we did it right here. So this state exists, put a slash that, and we get our state right there. So you can see state ID now. So if you are developing the front end for this, or you are developing an application, let's say an Android application that is consuming this, or a front-end application with JavaScript that needs to use this API, you can just basically do a fetch, a simple fetch, and then you get your data into your application. You can use HTML to manipulate that. Okay. So that's how you get one state. We can also like do a curl for that. Curl slash state slash dstate. You get that state, that specific state. Okay. Let's see. We have delete. I'll assume that if you can get a state, you can easily remove it from your database, right? Delete it, save the changes. Okay. For instance, in my case, I have a list. I have this list. So for instance, I did this to get a state. So instead of returning it, once I get that state, I can remove it from my list and then save the changes, and it will have been deleted. But a method that we needed to cover also, a route that we needed to cover is post. How do you add post? Post, just like we said, is basically to add something into your database. Yeah, post, add new data. And post takes a route name slash step. And something that you realized is that we are using plural to be able to identify, even when we are trying to get a specific resource, we are using plural for those resources, right? This is a good practice that I've seen in a lot of cases, including the LX, the intranet that you normally use. So you can see we get projects slash that specific project that you want. If you need all projects, you just do slash projects. But if you need one single project, you can do still, it's like you're getting all projects, and from that you are filtering and are returning just one project, right? So it's a common practice. I think it's a good practice to like name your resources in plural, though that just boils down to you, depending on how you need to design your APIs. So post will require us to develop an endpoint with this. So I'm going to add it right here. So app dot route going to be just like that. And we can define add stats or something, add stats. Add stat here. So how is the logic going to be? More like, let's say we need, okay. Let's say stats. We have like, I think one stat, two stats right now. What if I want to add another stat to this? In your database is going to be different, but my case I'm using a list. So what I can do is, I think append. Let's say we have a stat. Let's say new stat. New stat is going to be ID. Find some new stat. Arizona, let's add this one. So we have this ID. Now right there, we need to check it out first. And then we're going to have name and we call it that. Close that. Invalid syntax. Where is that coming from? Isn't this way to do that? What's the syntax error for? Okay.
You have
There's
to
a
bring,
missing.
you're missing one quote after the ID.
Okay.
Yeah.
Didn't see that. So yeah, seems good. So we can add this to the stats, and what we do is stats dot append new stat, right? So new stat. And then if we do stats, we get it's been added. So that's the same thing that we need to do to manipulate our database, right? So first things first, stat to add new stat. I'm going to add it right there. So I need to get that from the request that the user is going to pass. So how you get that is request dot get JSON. For that, I think we need to import this. So request. So we get the new stat. Basically here we're getting it from wherever the user passes to us. That's from curl. So we're going to use curl for that. It's like, you can see we're doing curl post and then the route to the stats, then content type. which basically for us is JSON, then the body of that, which is the resource that we need to add. Yeah. So I think that this is what we basically getting, right, from the user, whatever they give us. So right there we have our stats. Next thing we do is to append it into our database. In our case, it's not really a database, but you will do the same. Learn how you can't use append, obviously. So you can do something like, I don't know, in SQL Alchemy, how to add records, but you can check it out. SQL Alchemy. Or quick start. So I believe you have something like ID being mapped to that. So first you are creating that. This one will create the database. Some to that. So base metadata creates all. This one creates those records, the ones that you defined. So creating an object and persisting. So you will do something like this. For instance, data to add, then add it to, like, persist it in your session, then commit to your database just to ensure the changes reflect, right? So you could do something like this one right here. But I believe this is something you worked on earlier. So you already know how to add that. Just adding mine using append. And at this point, we have the data already in our database, right? So after that, we just need to, let's say, return. What do you want to return? Maybe the idea of whatever we added, or a success method. I think it's a good practice to return a success method wherever something is added, right? So return, if this one succeeded, then it means it was a success. So we just return a success method. Success message successfully added to DP or whatever, but just added works fine. Add stats. So let's test that out. Remember, we can't test it from our browser. So you're just going to use curl to be able to do that. Let's first get to see how many requests we have. Stats no longer working again. Let's see. Get stats 404. What's wrong?
It's possibly because of the extra /.
Okay, yeah, sure. Let's try stats. Okay, that works. No ID one. So how do we fix that?
In your route, you should add strict slashes equals to false.
Awesome. Yeah, strict underscore slashes, right?
Yeah, strict underscore slashes.
Correct. ROIC.
Yeah, you short an R there. Strict. Yeah.
So that will work.
Yeah.
Let's see. Ooh. Let me save that. Awesome. So we get our whatever. It doesn't matter whether we have a slash or not. So let's try this now. So let's say I have that. I copy this ID. I get the ID. I mistakenly put slash, I get not found. So let's also fix that. So what we do, we just copy this and add it here. And then we reload, we get our ID right there. That's nice. Let's try if the dev team here captured that. Wow. So it's returning the same resource. So that's something you should like take care of while developing your API, so that this route should be equal to that route. Obviously, because most of the cases users won't care about those details, and they might always give you a trailing slash right there. Okay, so let's now try and add a record. What are you going to add? Let me find another. So this one is a city. Let's add California twice. Let's try to add it twice. Before we do that, let's try to query its ID. Oh, we already added it actually. So let's add a California with a different ID. Let's say that ID. It doesn't exist right now, but we're going to add it. So just like we said, we use curl for that. Let me copy the command. Curl post. You can see we are defining the method as post, right? And we don't need the verb post mode. Paste it right down. Quite different for us. We do not have that. So curl post name is California. Let's say ID going to be the ID that we had here. Just get that ID, and then copy that. Let's call it actually a fake state because this ID is false. Fake state. A state called that. So let's try to add. We get method not allowed. So post sets 405 error code. You can see our Flask development server is intelligent enough to give us the error code, and you can just like find it when you get 405. What does it mean? You get method not allowed. Question to you, how do we fix that in our code so that we can be able to add a record?
I think you specify the method in the routes.
Okay, awesome. That's a correct answer. So we need to specify the method, but we didn't specify for others. What's the difference here? Is get the default or?
Yeah, actually, get is the default.
Okay. Then when we are using post, we need to tell our server that we actually like trying to edit our database. Remember, it's important to secure this in our, you don't need anyone to add anything to your database. So find ways maybe to secure your secure users from adding some malicious data into your database. For instance, you can use authentication to ensure that anyone who can add data or who can send data to your database is actually like a user that you trust, okay? So let's see now. Let's see. Method not allowed. What's the issue? 405 again. I think I added post right there. What's up? What's up? What's up? /stats/route. Or are we doing the wrong thing adding it? Let me see. Cal X. We have our data right there. What are we doing wrong? No.
I think ID is shorter than bust.
IDs?
Shorter, short. Then bust ID, we entered it.
ID is short. We actually aren't like checking. I don't think we are. So should we add some more random numbers or something?
No, I don't think the ID is the issue. Try, you see, in the methods array, try setting also get. So make it to have get and post.
Okay, you mean right here we add get, right?
Yeah, let's see if it will fix it.
All right, so I'm going to save that. Method not allowed.
What about the forward slash that you are using on scripts?
Okay, let's try to remove it.
The URL is having just one, and then you're using two. Strict slash is not ones to force.
Oh, yeah. That's a good catch, actually. So if we need to be forgiven of this forward slash, then we have to also add strict slashes here, right? So we need to add this. It's a good catch. The advantage of like pair programming. So when you can't see the errors, just tell one of your friends to join a call quickly and then just have them take a second eye. So you can see we successfully added that, right? So now if we reload our server, you can see we're getting the FX state that we just added. Oh, so Flask is also like intelligence to know that we are developing APIs and it gives us the print feature that I'm sure like you saw when you're working with the JSON stuff. Gives us that option. We didn't do anything and we have it here. You can print it nicely or just have, let's now try to get all states. You can see we have also the fake state right there. Let's add it again. Fake state 2 added successfully. Fake states, you can add as many as you want, but something you don't want is this one right here. In your databases, ensure the ID is unique, right? So when users need to get a certain state, it should return only one, not two. For instance, ours is returning two, and we try to query returns one, doesn't return two actually. I think the ID was the same. But basically, we need to ensure the IDs are different. And if you like, if you don't want two states with the same name, for instance, we added maybe states twice, we might not want to be able to do that. Yeah. So other things you could do is updating. So allowing the user to update. For instance, you misspelled the state name. You can have maybe the ability to be able to update it without necessarily you going into the database or just through this interface, because the application that's consuming your API doesn't have access to the database. So you might need to give it that permission to be able to update a state, which is basically changing a state that already exists, okay? So that's another method that you can take a look at. Some best practices, first, naming, use clear and consistent naming for your endpoints. You don't want at some point you are trying to get a state, then it's /state instead of /states, or different endpoints are giving you like, or let's say one endpoint, which is to get states, is /states. Another endpoint to get cities is /city. That's confusing your users. If you are using a naming convention, then just be consistent with it. Another thing that you should have noticed we didn't take care of was returning status codes to our users. That's something you need to do in your APIs. Error handling, that we tried a little bit, but we weren't like very perfect at it. For instance, right here, you can't know when state hasn't been added or not. So you might need to check if actually this method, if this one is successfully, then you might need to give a success method. If not, then give an error. So right here, you can see we handled an error if the state couldn't be found, okay? And such things. So those are just good practices. For a resource isn't found, tell your users that your users of the API, basically developers and the application that they are trying to build. Security, huge priority, mostly when you are moving to production, okay? With authentication, do it well. Documentation, really important. How do your users use your API, right? I do not know what your API does. So I need you to go ahead and document all the endpoints that you have. You can see concept. So you can see this one is Stack Overflow API. So you can see they have a very nice documentation. So write access, authentication, throttles. You can send like 1 million requests maybe in a second. Registering for an API key, like just basically how can I use your API if I need to. For instance, I need to query Stack Overflow so that I can get questions that are tagged Python and they aren't answered. By just going through the documentation, I should be able to do that. You can see as they advance, they aren't doing away with the initial versions. So you don't need to you don't want to replace your API completely. Let's say, for instance, we built a simple API that enables users to create and interact with states. Right now it's in production. Let's assume users are using it. Then I find out that I need to add to change this route. Instead of states, I need to get what? Let's say countries. I need to change it to countries. So I don't go ahead change here to countries and then replace everything that was in production. That's like being so untruthful to your users. So if you need to change these to, let's say, countries, make it a different version so that whoever was using your initial version that had /states can still have the applications working, the ones that are consuming your API. Anyone new who is starting to use your application, they can go to version 2 of you, let's say version 2 of your API, which is basically having this route /countries, okay? So that's that documentation really important. And for Flask, I think you have to do it to document everything yourself. But maybe if later you need to explore more, you can check Fast API. I think this one is going to document the endpoints for yourself using the Swagger something documentation. So Fast API. So good thing with this is it will give you some documentation automatically, okay? So you can just check it. It's quite easy to pick it up. You can compare and contrast it with Flask. But let's stick with Flask for now. So for Flask, ensure that you document your API as well, okay? To finish up, resources. These are just so, okay, we have this one, which has the guidelines, I think. Let's see from Amazon. Same things that we covered, uniform interface, stateless, but just explained in detail. So you can check it out. Let me share it in the chat. The other documentation, I think, is the one that we opened earlier, I believe. Oh, the other one is actually like Flask documentation. So just Google Flask documentation and you'll have that. That's it for now. Questions?
So please, I want to ask why are we using Ginger? There is this task that we had to use Ginger, yes. So I don't even I don't know why we are using it, because it's still it has its own syntax and everything, as if we are coding Python inside of it, but in a different way.
Yeah, so with Flask, supports Ginger templating, which is basically a way for you to more like interact with the data that you're getting from your backend. Remember, we are trying to run away from, let's say, things like JavaScript as much as we can. But in future, if you decide to specialize in backend, you might not need to learn Ginger or maybe any front-end thing. Think of Ginger as the front-end for your Flask applications or Django. Just a way for you
Okay,
to
now I
easily
get.
interact with your data. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So later, if you decide to specialize, you are going to be specializing to using Flask, to just develop your APIs, and then if you need to display those to your users, then you want to go ahead and use Ginger. You are going to have to use frameworks like React, Vue, and such. So think of Ginger just like an in the box or out of the box templating language that will enable you to at least create user interfaces for if you're building using Flask.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just a question out of wondering. So we did web server and there was Nginx, and then now we are busy with Flask. So the way I'm seeing this, it's like Flask is going to be our application server, and then maybe we're creating these APIs so that we have dynamic data from the database served through our Flask API, and then maybe the front end will connect via JS to our Flask server. Is that correct?
Exactly, that's correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah. So you're going to, at some point, you will host. Have you already done the deploy static project?
Yes, we did that.
Yeah, if you notice, that was like front end. So at some point you will have the back end of, so initially you did deploy static where you are trying to host your static content that you developed, which is more of the front end part of everything. And then later you are going to, just like you mentioned, an application project where you are going to like host your backend, the logic part of your application, and then consume that using the front end that you had building earlier, you hosted earlier. Yeah, so that they're going to connect all of them at some point.
Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Any other question? Okay, so that's it for me. Thank you so much for joining, and good luck in building your RESTful APIs. Goodbye.